Before I introduce our speaker, I'll say a few words about the Trust. We're an independent research charity that was founded in 1978 by 5 Cambridge academics, Professor Sir Hal Bailey, who was Professor of Sanskrit, and the archaeologists Bridget and Raymond Alchin, together with 2 Dutch colleagues, Professor Joan van Lohuizen and Jan van Lohuizen. The Trust covers a broad range of activities covering South Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and parts of Central and Southeastern Asia as well. Activities include, well, a wide range of activities, including public lectures, of which this is our Cambridge Festival one for this year. If you would like to hear more about us or keep in touch, we have a mailing list, so do see the details for signing up on that on our website. And I should also add that as we receive no public funds, we particularly welcome support from those who join our friends for a very modest figure. So on to tonight's lecture by Cameron Petrie. After his PhD at the University of Sydney, he moved to Oxford as a research fellow at Somerville College, and then came on to Cambridge in 2005, joining the Department of Archaeology, where he is now Professor in South Asian and Iranian archaeology, as well as being a trustee of our trust here. Amongst his many activities, he is the project leader of the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project, which is an international collaborative project hosted by the MacDonald Institute that started in 2016. And we look forward to hearing more about that and welcome him now.
Thank you very much, Piers. It's very kind. Piers actually helpfully gave a very brief reference to the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project, which is called MASA for short. And what will be apparent from this introductory slide and what will be apparent from the presentation as a whole is that we're dealing with a lot of archaeological evidence, but also a lot of maps. And what you can see on the slide here, and I'll make reference to it now, just in case I don't later, is a map that was produced in 1905 by a mapping agency called the Survey of India. The Archaeological Survey of India was an offshoot of that. But the Survey of India was set up within the same decade as the Ordnance Survey of the United Kingdom, and actually set out to do the same sorts of things, but across a much, much larger area, trying to map the whole of the subcontinent as part of the British Imperial Project, or whichever terminology you'd like to use to encapsulate that. What's interesting is that these maps were produced at an extremely high standard during the 20th century due to complaints by the British military authorities that the maps that they had up until that point didn't have enough detail on them to be used to efficiently manage the imperial domains. What we've learned recently is that these maps incorporate all sorts of useful information for people that want to run an empire, but actually, incidentally, they document enormous amounts of archaeological information as well. And the little blue circles that you see on this map highlight some of those features. There are monuments, there are temples, there are mosques, there are churches, there are administrative buildings, but there are also dozens, hundreds and thousands of archaeological sites that are documented on these maps. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you a little bit of an overview of the sorts of information that are available and set out really to answer a series of questions. And I quite like this particular image because it actually says success begins with thinking and thinking begins with asking questions. This is actually propaganda from the Second World War, but it actually outlines all of these different terms that are actually very, very common when we think about and ask questions. So hopefully by the end of the talk, I will have addressed the where, why, who, how, what, and when of the MASA project and all of the mapping that we're actually engaging in. I realize I sort of have set myself a relatively big task in the sense that I'm probably going to try and give an overview of a very large geographical area, a long chronological period, the methods that we've been using, and hopefully maintain your interest throughout the whole talk. There is a risk that I'll go into too much detail. It's also a risk that I won't give you enough detail, but I'm more than happy to ask questions later on as well. But just to make sure that we're all in the right on the right page, so to speak, the master project actually is something that Piers alluded to. It's the culmination of a series of projects that have been running based in Cambridge and working especially with my collaborator, Professor R.N. Singh, who's in the room, and many students, colleagues, friends who have been involved. And so you'll see these logos that'll appear, and it's if different logos appear, it's really my attempt to try and make sure that I'm giving due credit to those who have done the work. What the master project is attempting to do is quite a large scale project. You have to spot the animations that have snuck into the presentation. We're talking about South Asia largely, but we're actually talking about a specific region that I'll probably make reference to, the Indus River Basin. This is a geographical unit that's dominated by the Indus River and the other rivers of Punjab, which all originate in the Himalayas, and then they actually all join together and then flow out into the Arabian Sea. Now, those rivers and the surrounding areas encapsulate an extremely large geographical area. We were trying to come up with a unit of measurement that everyone could understand, and we decided that a unit of measurement that people could get a grasp on was the size of Wales. This area is more than 20 times the size of Wales. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of the region that we're talking about, but also actually the difference in size between what the Survey of India was doing and what the Ordnance Survey has been doing in the British Isles. So this is an area that includes parts of Pakistan and the northwestern regions of India. And this is an area that is actually extremely full of archaeological heritage and archaeological heritage sites. Now, this image gives you a little bit of an idea of the nature of the diversity of archaeological heritage that exists. We're talking about sites that go all the way from the Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods, the establishment of settled occupation, all the way up through all of the chronological periods that relate to different periods of urbanism, the many states and empires that exist, the growth of the major religions of the subcontinent, and the sort of decline of some of those religions. We're talking about religious buildings and structures that relate to those religions, mosques, fortresses, things like rock art. All of this falls under the remit of archaeological heritage, which we're actually setting out to try and document. One of the reasons why we're doing the documentation is because a very significant quantity of this heritage is actually under threat. Largely under threat due to the ravages of time, but often also under threat through deliberate acts of destruction and damage, which happen as a result of development, very much so. So the subcontinent as a whole and many, many countries in the world are undergoing rapid population growth, rapid development, rapid urbanization, rapid increases in agricultural exploitation. And all of those sorts of processes of development and economic growth create resource problems and challenges when it comes to access to land and use of land and various sorts of other things. So what we're trying to do with our project is, in a sense, engaging in a little bit of a race against time to try and document what we can before it ceases to be. And it's beyond our remit to do to engage in all sorts of elements of further types of activities. But what we're really trying to do is to help create resources that can be used to document and protect heritage as much as possible. And one of the tools we're going to be using, or we are using, is geographical information systems, or GIS, which is mapping software and mapping resources that can be used in the digital sphere. And we use a lot of digital tools to try and identify archaeological sites and go further beyond that. So just as an example of the sorts of development processes that are taking place, What you can see here are two different images of an archaeological site in northern India. This is within the city of Sirsa in Haryana. The top image, I'll just go back again so you can see it. The top image was what Sirsa looked like in the 2010s. And you can see an ancient mound is actually hidden under the urban sprawl, the growth of this city. And what the city authorities decided to do was to clear the houses off the top of this. So as you can imagine, people have established houses and started to effectively own property in a specific location. Then the authorities have reclaimed that land and protected it. So we have sources of tension and conflict within government agencies, social situations, and all sorts of other circumstances. We're talking about, the right to own land and do things. So this is an issue that's a current source of tension. But this is an enormous archaeological site. It's 9 hectares in size. It now sits in the middle of a city. It does actually sit very, very visibly on the historical maps. And it's about 15 meters high. It's very, very hard to miss. Helpfully, it's also quite difficult to destroy. But it is a place which is not straightforward when it comes to protection, management, and all sorts of other issues. So the MASA project is, in terms of answering for some of these questions, the who and the what, the MASA project is an international collaboration. It involves a team of researchers based here in Cambridge, but also collaborators in a number of different countries and collaborators from both Pakistan and India. And we're really setting out to document archaeological sites. And you can see examples of those sorts of sites here. We're not talking about a small project. This is a project that involves many, many different people. We've got collaborators at different academic institutions in both India and Pakistan. We've also got collaborators in government agencies and government institutions. And we have colleagues and collaborators based at 2 different universities in Spain. And we have a very active team as well. And several of them are sitting in the room, and several of them are shown on this photograph, and you may be able to ask them questions later. But this is very much a sort of co-created research project where we're engaging in the creation of a database of a big list of archaeological sites. So we're really setting out to, in a sense, document the known archaeological sites, but also to effectively rediscover sites that have not been documented before. And we want to collect that information and to share it with people that can make use of it. So we're really collecting archaeological information about sites that have been recorded over the last century or so. Some have been known for even longer. And we're compiling that information together. We're using a lot of maps. We're using a lot of historical maps. The image on the left shows the many, many thousands of maps that were generated by the Survey of India. The image on the top right shows the distribution of many of the known archaeological sites. And it looks as though we've found thousands, but actually there are many, many thousands more within the same area. And ultimately, we're ending up putting all of that information into a database which is open access in the sense that it is available to the general public to look at and search. But there will be some restrictions so that more information is available to heritage professionals that are responsible for protecting these sites and making sure that they're not looted and destroyed. And that database is, the database system that we're using is called Arches. And this is a free database that's been developed by the Getty Research Institute in the US. And it's designed to be open source. So effectively anybody can create their own Arches database. It's a GIS-based database, so it uses geospatial information. It uses a certain type of an ontology, a way of thinking and describing terminology that's standardized. And we're engaging. We're one of many projects that are using this system, and we're using it's very much those who are interested. It's a relational database. It has lots of information. It records links between different categories of information. It enables people to search information about who did the surveys of archaeological sites or who made the maps and all sorts of other types of information. And all of the information that we're collecting as well is drawing on resources that are kept at places like the British Library or the University Library in Cambridge. And the imagery that we're getting access to is ultimately going to be available in a format that can be used by whoever has the interest in using it. And on the right-hand side at the bottom, you can see a little bit of what this database looks like in action. It uses maps. It uses dots on maps to show archaeological sites. The larger the dot, the more archaeological sites there are. At the moment, we haven't got a lot of data in the database, but it will be growing over time. Now I'm going to show you an image, two images. The first one is a little bit scary. This is our workflow that we use. Lots of stages and steps, lots of different methods. Effectively, what we're doing is using quite a complex workflow that can actually be simplified. We're making use of legacy information from published archaeological resources. We're making use of historical maps that have been published in the late 19th and early 20th century. We're using freely available remote sensing imagery. Many countries are collecting data with satellites flying around the globe. There are also a lot of now declassified spy images that are also available. We're making use of those. We're making use of machine learning computers to find things on satellite images and find things on maps. We're trying to reconstruct hydrology and river systems, and we're also checking things on the ground. So that's a sequence of things, and I'm going to talk about each one of those briefly to give you a little bit of an idea of exactly what it is that we're doing and what it is that we're learning. More of the W questions. So in terms of explaining the how, I'm going to start briefly with the legacy data that we use. Now, this is a map that shows you the distribution of a lot of the known archaeological sites in the Indus River Basin. Now, this distribution looks quite impressive if you look at it at a certain level. There's very, very big clusters of archaeological sites in certain areas. And basically what this is a compilation of information from academic publications that have been generated over the last 30 or 40 years. In the end, we now know that there is at least 9,000 archaeological sites in this region, which is based on the published information from these volumes and books. But if you look at the distribution of those archaeological sites, we know that there's not a nice, neat, even distribution of where the sites are visible. You can see actually there's one very, very big cluster of archaeological sites around the area that you can see there identified as Gunweriwala. This is one extremely large survey from the 70s. And there are big distributions of sites, that's in Pakistan, and there's big distributions of sites in 2 areas in India. But there are many areas that don't have very much evidence at the moment. And that is actually almost certainly misleading. Most of the work that's been done so far is used a method called village-to-village survey. This usually involves research teams going out there in vehicles and going to visit a local village. For example, this is the village of Lohari Rago in India. And usually you pull up somewhere in the village, talk to usually older gentlemen that are sitting around having tea under a tree. Not always. That's not meant to be a stereotype. This is actually very common. And those are the men and people in local villages who usually know where archaeological sites are. There's a sequence of questions that are usually asked, and they'll say, oh, yes, I know about material like that. I know a place where there's a mound or some pottery or some sort of ancient site, and they'll point off to the directions. So inevitably, that's the type of method that's informed a lot of archaeological research that's been carried out. But we now know that although we have these thousands of archaeological sites that have been published, there's a lot of inaccuracy and imprecision in the data. So many sites are recorded multiple times. They're published and republished by different people who think that they're finding a new site each time. Sometimes people make transcription errors and they get very, very substantial mistakes in the locations of those sites. So these create problems when you try and work out which is the correct location. We also know that there are lots of rivers and channels, but there doesn't appear to be very many archaeological sites located along those rivers and channels. So that makes it problematic when you sort of assume that everyone needs water and they want to live close to a river. If you go looking for a site along the river, you don't necessarily find it. We also know that the distribution of the archaeological sites is very heavily dictated by where people have looked rather than where the sites actually are. So what this image shows is the distribution of sites, the red dots and the orange dots. And if you look closer, you can see the little white outlines. Those are the district boundaries of different states and provinces in Pakistan and India. And you can see some districts have been surveyed very carefully. And you can look to a district immediately adjacent to it, and there's almost no archaeological sites in it. That doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It just means no one's actually looked or published the data from that result. So the information that we have is patchy, and it's dictated by where people have looked rather than where things are. So we really know for sure that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of sites that are not recorded. And our aim at the moment is to resolve that problem. So we look at historical maps, and I mentioned briefly these Survey of India maps. So these maps were produced in the 19th and 20th centuries during the period of British control. They actually also continue to be produced after independence and partition as part of the surveys that have been carried out in Pakistan and India. These maps are extremely detailed. They are issued in a 1 inch to 1 mile scale. They have legends that match up with what we see on the historic ordnance survey maps. They often list antiquities that are marked in a specific way. And they usually use certain symbols to show elevations. And what you can see on the middle right-hand side is different symbols being used to show things that are in order 12 feet, 10 feet, or 8 feet in height. Those symbols usually indicate an elevated area of ground. And we know from our experiences that very, very commonly, those are archaeological sites. And you can see on the top right-hand side a series of archaeological sites that Cambridge and Banaras Hindu University teams have actually worked on, which were being recorded in 1905 by a survey teams. We discovered them in 2010 and then started doing our fieldwork. So we were actually sort of almost a century out of date from the time that they were originally documented. And in actual fact, post facto, we worked out that exactly what was going on in terms of all of this documentation. What really proved to us that we were on the right track of something interesting was when we started to look on the historical maps that related to some really famous archaeological sites. Sites like Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi, Dholavira, these are all famous Indus civilization sites. Mohenjo-daro was surveyed over 10 years before it was first documented by an archaeologist. Rakhigarhi was surveyed in 1905 and was discovered by archaeologists in the 1960s. Dholavira was reported in the 1970s and was actually on maps produced almost a century earlier and marked with a cross. You can see it's marked as an abandoned village. So these maps contain an abundance of information. And what's interesting is that they contain more information than we often realize. So on this is a map of a site called Agroha, which is a protected site. This was a site that was excavated in the 1930s. And you can see on the map on the left-hand side, it has 81R. That's 81 feet high. It's gigantic. That part there that's got a very substantial wiggly line around it is the protected mound. But if you look around it, there's all sorts of other information. You can see another little outline of a mound immediately adjacent to it. You can see the traces of another circular fortification wall, which has got 2 spot heights on it. These are parts of this same archaeological site that have not been documented before by archaeologists, but they have been documented by surveyors 100 years ago. There's all sorts of information that's waiting to be found. So what the project is doing is systematically using these maps to document archaeological sites. We're extracting information off them. The maps are quite large, and the team we have got scans of these maps from the University Library in Cambridge or the British Library, and the team has georeferenced, so put them into geographical space of over 1,300 of these maps. Those are the ones that are shown in green. The ones in purple are the ones that are missing, that we don't yet know where they are. We don't yet know where good copies of them are. The ones in yellow are ones that we have, but we haven't yet made use of. So these surveys provide the opportunity to really look at a landscape that is actually no longer exists. It's a landscape of 100 years ago They show thousands of potential mound features. And we're georeferencing the maps, but we're also using other tools to identify the map features across this very large landscape. And we're learning lots of things about the maps. We're learning that maps of different periods are complicated. Maps that were produced by different people are different. They use slightly different symbols. They make different decisions because people aren't computers and they're not machines. So they're making all sorts of decisions all of the time. But we're using computers to look at these maps and to try and identify the specific features that we know are used to mark out these mounds that are archaeological sites. So we're able to detect these little outlines called form lines or hatched mounds. And we're working with colleagues based in Tarragona in Spain, and they've developed some computer algorithms that are able to detect features and draw outlines around them, and then we know precisely where they are. And we can match those up with remote sensing imagery that's been taken more recently. All of these things like map sheets, satellite photographs, remote sensing imagery, they're all layers of time in many respects. We know that the archaeological sites are many thousands of years old, but these map sheets let us look at what they were like in the 19th and early 20th century. Then the remote sensing imagery lets us look at things more recently. So we're using a lot of people power, a lot of computational power as well. The same colleagues in Tarragona were working here in Cambridge a few years ago, and they developed a different algorithm that can look at satellite images. And we tell the computer that these features on the left-hand side are archaeological sites. We know that they're archaeological sites because people have been to visit them. And we tell the computer to try and find similar examples of those sites in different areas, looking at satellite imagery. Now, satellite imagery takes imagery in multiple spectra. So it's not just looking at the red RGB, red, green, and blue, but it's also looking at infrared and other types of spectral information is collected. And it is possible to use a computer to process that imagery and then find archaeological sites. Now, what you can see on the right-hand side is effectively the rediscovery of a lot of archaeological sites in an area called Cholistan, which is in southern Punjab. And this is an area that's been surveyed before, but we were able to identify new archaeological sites, establish that their sizes were different to what was previously assumed, and also to effectively engage in a remote survey that provides all sorts of information for people to look at on the ground. We've also been able to combine that with using the same techniques to monitor when there are threats to those archaeological sites. So we tell the computer, look at this archaeological site. Does the amount of water close to the site change? Does the amount of agriculture close to a site change? And these images show areas that are under cultivation have colors. The area in green are the areas that were under cultivation before 2017. And then as you get the colors go from green to increasingly darker red, that's the land use that's changed over time. And you can actually see that there were certain areas that saw the expansion of irrigation-based agriculture in this particular period. So this is all happening over the last 5 or 6 years. When there are high levels of rainfall, farmers are able to expand their agricultural practices and bring more land under cultivation. So what we can actually see, in some instances, archaeological sites are preserved, but in others, they come under threat and the land is turned into agricultural land. So it's actually possible to monitor this, which is both sort of exciting, but also quite sobering when you see the changes that are actually happening in the landscape. So I mentioned at the beginning the idea about modeling hydrology. Now, why would we need to bother about rivers? Now, what's interesting and important is that the lands of the Indus Basin, especially Punjab, are under constant change. Now, this is actually a very high resolution digital elevation model that you can see in the background. It shows you a flat agricultural landscape. If you're actually looking there, you wouldn't necessarily see most of these features. But when you process some of the imagery that's available, you can actually see the traces of rivers, the traces of channels that are left, the banks of rivers, the locations of villages, and all sorts of other sorts of information. Now, the historical maps that we have contain an abundance of information about where rivers were 100 years ago. Perhaps not surprisingly, the rivers aren't necessarily in the same location anymore because they move, floods happen. River banks and riverbeds are actually quite wide and unstable. And this map shows something quite interesting. On the lower side, it shows the winding courses of the Sutlej River. In the middle area, you can see areas of the floodplain. And at the top on the left-hand side, you can see areas that have been converted into very intensive irrigation agriculture, the canal colonies, which is what they were referred to in southern Punjab. So these maps contain a lot of hydrological information, but they also have traces of the locations of sites. You can see Tiba Sher Khan is listed. There is actually a named archaeological site on this one. All of these different features are shown on these different maps. And we're making use of those, the maps themselves to find the sites, but also to find the rivers. Now, as I mentioned, there's relatively few archaeological sites on the modern watercourses, but it's very likely that there's lots of archaeological sites on ancient watercourses. So knowing where the rivers were helps us understand what the landscape was like in the past. And we also need to understand the potential risks to archaeological sites over time and really to have a keen understanding of the landscape. So what we've started to do is to use a number of steps to really try and reconstruct where rivers were at certain times and combine that information with the locations of archaeological sites. So we get an understanding of how the landscape changed, and also to understand why archaeological sites may be missing in certain locations. Is it because there were no sites there, or is it because the rivers have destroyed the sites over time? Both of those things are possible. So we're using Survey of India maps. We're using remote sensing imagery that's been collected by NASA, and also imagery that's been collected by the German Space Agency. And we process that using a lot of different techniques, looking at differences in vegetation, looking at the way that the colored spectra change, looking at things like the multispectral, multi-scale relief model on the right-hand side. And team members have been using these different methods. These are different imagery showing exactly the same area on the map, and revealing information about the locations of individual river channels, their morphological shape, how they may have changed. Most of the satellite imagery gives us information about the most up-to-date morphodynamics, but we also have the Survey of India maps that take us back 50 or 100 years. And we can trace off these different resources where these river channels were and understand how they lay together and change over time. We're also looking at archaeological sites on the ground. Not everything is being done on a computer, a long way away from the stuff that we're actually studying. And we have teams that are going out and actually engaging in archaeological survey. Now, it's probably useful for me to explain exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about an archaeological site. Some of the time I'm talking about a big temple or a heritage building that looks very, very obvious. But a lot of the archaeology in this region is actually something very, very ephemeral, and it doesn't look very prominent. And what you can see here at the top are two examples of archaeological sites that have actually been converted into agricultural land. Farmers own the land, own the rights to farm the land, and they want to turn that land into something productive. So a lot of archaeological sites have very heavy evidence of ploughing and leveling, the construction of small irrigation canals. And these are the two examples here are archaeological sites that are 5,000 years old, that have been in the process of being gradually eaten away by progress. We also have examples of archaeological sites that are actually protected in some respects. This is an area that's the agricultural fields are growing very, very close to the archaeological site that you can see there. But the site itself has been protected by a landowner who's putting small shrines and things in different parts of the site to prevent people from expanding their agricultural land any further. So we have a lot of variability in the level of preservation, but it is possible to actually use these mound features on the maps and to visit archaeological sites and to document them while they're still there. And we're visiting archaeological sites using a method where we use digital tools. The project has developed tools that can be used on tablets and phones, and people can actually document archaeological sites following a method that we have developed. In many respects, sometimes these mounds are quite well preserved, and you can see that there's still material that can be collected from the surface, and we can date the site, and we can make an assessment of its significance. But in some instances, the sites have already been quite heavily ploughed and are largely destroyed, and the material that's left is very, very limited in actual sense. But we're actively engaging in survey at the minute. This is a surveys that have been carried out in collaboration with students and colleagues from 2 different universities in India. On the left-hand side is a survey done near Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh, and on the right-hand side is a survey done on the edge of the Run of Kutch with colleagues from Kerala. Now, this is and the team was sort of being led in the field by Kuili Suganya, who's one of our project members. And in a sense, we've engaged in a whole series of steps that I'm describing. We've identified features on historical maps. There's been a lot of pre-planning to identify where to go on the ground. And what you can see is very, very revealing. On the left-hand map, you can see some white dots. Those were the known archaeological sites before we'd done this survey. The pink dots are all of the new features that were being found in November and December. On the right-hand side, you can see the map. There is one known and documented archaeological site up until 2 months ago, when many dozens of new archaeological sites have been added to the list. These landscapes are full of archaeology, and you can see it exists in various forms. Sometimes these sites are completely enormous. Sometimes they've been quite heavily damaged. Sometimes they're protected by structures built on them. And sometimes you can see this on the right-hand side. This is an image that Kuili presented to us last week. This is an example of a modern house that's been built with pottery built into the wall. This is an ancient archaeological material that's been included in the archaeological site, in a modern building, therefore confusing and confounding the problems. Now, I don't just want to talk about method. It is actually a little bit useful to talk about the sort of the what and the when of what we're looking at. We are actually finding various things that date to specific chronological periods. So we're not purely doing documentation, but we are actually engaging in research. And I'm going to just briefly give you a little bit of an insight into the types of patterns and changes that we're documenting in an area of Northwest India, Haryana and Punjab, and an area in Pakistan, in the southern part of Punjab around Multan. Now, these areas are really significant for many reasons. One of the reasons is that there's an often discussed paleo river that crosses this landscape, yet another river that is a part of the Punjab hydrological system. It's referred to by different names in different countries. It's called the Ghaggar or the Hakra, depending on which part of the landscape you're in. It's also often been referred to as the mythological Sarasvati River, that's referred to in a range of religious texts. And there's been a lot of effort by hydrologists and archaeologists to try and match up archaeology with this paleo channel and to date the paleo channel and come up with some solutions. The river, the Lost River, has often been suggested as one of the reasons why the Indus civilization, the earliest period of urbanism in South Asia, all underwent decline and collapse. But there's also been suggestions that the river actually is possibly dates to the early part of the the period after the last ice age and the growth of a very large river when glaciers melted in the Himalayas, and that it possibly dried up as many as 8,000 years ago. So there's a lot of debate. So in actual fact, archaeology is in a position to help with revealing information about these sorts of river systems. So as part of the project work, my colleague and I, Hector Arengo, set about reconstructing the paleochannels, working out whether this big Gaga Hakra River was the only river channel in this area, or there were many, many other channels that may have existed. Inevitably, what was revealed was an accumulation of information that people have been collecting since the 1980s. But in actual fact, this area of northwestern India probably has an extremely complicated hydrology. Many rivers that become active when it rains. And you can actually see these rivers on this digital elevation model. You can see many, many dozens of channels. These channels fill up with water when the monsoon comes. Water does flow out of the Himalayas and cross the landscape at certain times. So this is the complex hydrological landscape. What we as archaeologists do are looking at where archaeological sites sit in that landscape. Now, this is the earliest period of occupation in this region. This is what's called the early Harappan period. This is before cities had existed. These are the earliest villages in northwestern India. And we're matching up the location of the villages with the location of the river channels. And you can see very often there are sites sitting next to rivers. You can see there's a pair of lines that zigzag from the middle left all the way up to the top right. That's the Gaga Hakra River that's now dry. In actual fact, the vast majority of sites are not located adjacent to that large river. They're located in other parts of the landscape. And there's many sites that have no known watercourses. That distribution of settlements change when we get to the urban period, the urban phase of the Indus civilization. We have the earliest city in this region develops at Rakhigarhi, and we seem to have certain parts of the landscape become depopulated. Many, many sites are located close to rivers, but many sites are located in different areas again. If we look at the post-urban period after Rakhigarhi is abandoned, we see further changes. Areas of the landscape appear to become depopulated. Settlements are established in new areas. So we're seeing change over time. So the location of these sites tell us about how people were living in the landscape. Perhaps they were abandoning the areas further to the west and moving to the east where there were more reliable monsoon rains. Lots of different patterns, lots of different changes. After the early phase of urbanism, we see further changes. But what becomes really revealing is when we look at the historical periods, the second period of urbanism in the subcontinent, we see a massive proliferation of settlement, and the whole of the landscape appears to be resettled. And that continues into the medieval period as well. So largely you can see these are traces of hundreds and thousands of archaeological sites, which we can identify spatially. But when we start to pick them apart, we can look at the way that people living in the landscape changes over time. Now, I'm just going to shift briefly over to show you some of the evidence that's quite similar that we've had revealed in the southern part of Punjab in Pakistan. So this is the area where we've got the city of Multan is in the middle on the left-hand side. And you can see the area between the Ravi River in the top and the city of Harappa, which you can just see in the middle to the top right-hand side, the Sutlej River at the bottom, and the blue line wiggling through the middle across this image is the Beas River. Now, this course of the Beas River existed at some point in the Bronze Age, but had dried up at some point in the past. Now, what the archaeological settlement information shows is the distribution of sites, which you can see as red dots. What's revealed when you start to reconstruct where the rivers were and where the watercourses were is an explanation as to why the sites are located where they were. You can see that there's a cluster of archaeological sites located in the bottom left, which I'll just show briefly here. Now, this is a set of 4 archaeological sites, and it was recently suggested that these sites were perhaps being provided with water by an extremely long irrigation canal that was either coming from the Sutlej or from the Beas River. In actual fact, what I think is much more likely is the Sutlej River was probably extremely close to these archaeological sites in the past. You can see that the floodplain of the Sutlej is about 40 kilometers wide, and the river channel itself has probably been moving continuously for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, impacting upon this landscape. We also, so this is that image really highlights that the rivers themselves are an active participant in this process. They cause changes and modifications to the landscape, and they influence where we're finding archaeological sites. You can see the old Beas River in the middle has many, many archaeological sites located very close to it. What's interesting is that those archaeological sites located close to the Beas continue into the historical periods. And what we can see on this particular image, especially around Multan, is the distribution of many, many sites in an area where there's now, again, no river, no watercourse. And it appears very likely that in the medieval period and the historical periods, there was an active river channel and an active set of irrigation canals that were supporting all of these settlements that are to the east of Multan. At some point, the river moved, and it moved further to the west of Multan. And this is something that's had impact upon people living in these landscapes. Now, to just make sure I'm not putting you all to sleep and pretending that there's no actual people in all of this, in what the work that we're doing, we are actually trying to understand how people lived in these landscapes and where archaeological settlements were, but we're also extremely conscious of what the team are particularly interested in terms of the marginal histories that are encapsulated in all of this research that we're carrying out. There are numerous photographs. Inevitably, the Survey of India, when it was established, was an imperial institution, and it comes with all of the baggage and the problems of imperial control of third countries. A lot of the documentation has racist language. And it underplays the role of people from the subcontinent in the work. And a lot of this information is encapsulated in the documentation on the maps and the descriptions that are written in books and manuals and guidebooks. What's interesting is that in the 19th century, there is often specific references to the British military surveyors and the surveying officers, but also the different Survey of India employees from the subcontinent who were involved, and they're often named as individuals on the maps. In the beginning of the 20th century, that changed, and all of that additional information was removed, and the Surveyor General is typically the only person that's listed. So we're actually getting evidence for sort of changes in imperial policy and documentation that are happening over time. And we're collecting all sorts of information as part of that, part of the process of us looking at the maps and revealing stories about the Indian surveyors or subcontinent surveyors that are involved in the process. We're seeing the range of types of historical documentation that exists in different collections, whether they're in Survey of India records or different sorts of national archives. And we're using that information to lay the groundwork for future research that can be undertaken by people that want to follow that up. So in addition to that sort of data collection, a lot of the work that we're doing is also focusing on training and building capacity with our collaborators in India and Pakistan. We have people that are currently Cambridge-based who are traveling to India and Pakistan to engage in training. We're teaching them the methods that we're using. We're sharing the information with them as well. And we're using resources that are effectively open source and open access so that there's no restriction in terms of the equipment that we're making use of. We're making use of computers, definitely, but some of the resources we use can be used on a smartphone that is probably one of the most prevalent tools around the planet at the minute. Realistically, what we're really trying to do is to, in a sense, come up with a transformative approach to increase the level of equality in archaeological research practice. That's both, I guess, for want of a better word, international equality, but also gender-based equality as well. And we're trying to ensure that there are higher levels of sustainability in this sort of approach to the archaeological research. So we're bringing colleagues and scholars to Cambridge for workshops. We're traveling to India and Pakistan for workshops. We're engaging in online and in-person training. And members of the team have also developed the South Asian Women in the Field initiative, which is meeting regularly, holds seminars, and engages in training, conversation, discussion, and sharing of knowledge and sharing of experience. Realistically, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we don't create resources that are not usable for the people that are the ones that are most likely to make good use of these things as well. I hope I haven't lost you on the way. I did promise to end with some people. I've posed some questions at the start, and I hopefully have answered at least some of them. I'm more than happy to answer more questions. It would be very remiss of me not to mention a lot of, in some ways, anonymized institutions and people who are really fundamentally important to the work that we've been doing. The master project, as I sort of said at the beginning, is effectively standing on the shoulders of a lot of other earlier projects. The research project called the Land Water Settlement Project and the Two Rains projects, which were running in the 2000s and 2010s, all the way up into the early 2020s. We have many teams of people who have been involved in that process. We have a number of collaborating institutions. We have funders, including Arcadia, which is the funder for the master project in its broader scope. So we have many partner institutions and collaborators. I'd really like to thank them all. We've also benefited enormously from our connections and proximity of the Cambridge University Library and also the British Library, which has the India Office map collection, which is the most terrifyingly enormous collection of maps I think I'll probably ever see. And we're gradually working our way through it. And those of you who are more digitally ready to go for it, there's a QR code on the bottom left-hand side. There's a website that you can visit. And we also are reasonably active on social media and things, posting things. And I know for a fact that this lecture is being recorded, and please feel free to encourage anyone else that would like to watch it to watch it. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, Cameron, thank you very much for such a fascinating description of a very important project. Multifaceted people, as well as the archaeological material that you're finding, you're working on. I'd like to kick off questions by asking, to what extent, I mean, granted that the survey maps are unique to this area.
Yes.
How much are you a pioneer of this sort of project on a global scale? How much is going on elsewhere?
Oh, that's a very helpful question. So that's in many ways. So this is Arcadia are funding a series of projects similar to this. There's a project called EAMINA. There's another project which is working in endangered archaeology of Middle East and North Africa. So they're actually working in many of the countries that people would broadly fit under the banner of Middle East and the whole strip of Northern Africa. There's a Sub-Saharan Africa project that's based in Cambridge called MAIASAM. There's a Central Asia project called CAL, CAAL, and we're all using similar systems. But what's very interesting is that in each country, the resources that are available are different. So all of the different European empire building countries engaged in mapping programs, but they all did it slightly differently. The British were actually extremely consistent at certain points in time. And I learned in the process of discovery is that there was a imperial cartography conference that was first held in Cambridge in the 1930s, where they brought all of the director generals of the surveys of India and everywhere else all came here and had a big discussion about how imperial mapping was going. And interestingly enough, Crawford, OGS Crawford, who was working for the Ordnance Survey, gave a presentation saying archaeological sites appear on maps. What's interesting is that I think what we're doing in the subcontinent was almost like an open secret, or something that everyone sort of knew but wasn't really doing much about for a very long time. So looking at publications by Walter Fairservice in the 1950s, he says, we found sites, they're on maps. But he only looked at about 10 of them. And when I started working in the subcontinent, people would say that to me, have a look at the maps, you'll see some things. But no one had, I think the big difference for us is that no one has attempted to do it at scale. Everyone would look at 1 or 2 maps and then they'd be happy to do that. And I think then we sort of realized, oh, actually, I went to the UL here and I got 30 maps, and we went out to India on the very first time and I had the maps and we were lining them all up. And then we started to realize that basically we could do this across a vast area. And that's the new bit, in a sense. The working at scale has never been attempted before.
Thank you. Well, other questions? Yeah.
I have 2 points here. Number one concerns the shifting of rivers. I can give you an example from Lahore. The river Ravi used to flow to the east of Lahore. Then it shifted and came around the walled city. And then it shifted 1 mile to the west. So this meandering, as it's called,
Yes,
has taken place. Have archaeological sites been left behind because the river meandered? Number one. The second issue is that you have very, very ancient planned cities, like the world's oldest is in Balochistan of Pakistan, which is called Mehergarh. It's said to be 12,500 years old. How do you cater for a very, very ancient, probably the oldest in the world, like Mehergarh?
So to answer your first question first, so the short answer is yes, definitely. I think the river channels, especially a place like Lahore, where it's moved from different parts of the city, the older channels are very likely to have archaeological sites associated with them. But as the rivers meander and move, then I think there's a belt in the floodplain where the sites will possibly be removed. It really depends on what happens when the flood happens. And there are barrages and diversions that occur. One of the things we've been concerned about is actually there's a Ravi River development happening south of Lahore, where they're building thousands of new houses in the floodplain. Well, sorry, in the old floodplain. But in actual fact, that could become activated if the river moves again. So that's something, I mean, this happens in Britain too. Older floodplains people are building on, and then all of a sudden there's a flood that happens, or the rain is strong and unusual. So what my understanding of what happens with these rivers is that they're very meandering in the off season, and then when you get heavy monsoon, the rivers fill, and the actual beds can shift quite significantly. So I often show an image of the area of southern Punjab and Sindh, which has flooded extremely badly in the last 15 years. There was a big Punjab flood in the 2010s, and then 2 years back, there was the Sindh floods. And that's where the river goes from being 1 kilometre wide to being 20 kilometres wide, and the land is devastated. But at that point in time, the rivers move significantly. So what's interesting about trying to match it up with your second question, you asked about Mehergarh, and Mohenjo-Daro is actually not so far from Mehergarh. And it looks like the river has moved in relationship to Mohenjo-Daro as well. So that's a shifting situation. The oldest part of Mehergarh is sitting on the edge of the Bolan River that comes through the Bolan Pass. And the site is partly known because the river was eroding the site away. So you can see this 8-meter high archaeological site that's been cut by the river. So interestingly enough, that particular site is sitting in a very specific geographical location. It's on where the river comes out of the mountains, it creates a big fan, and the site's sitting on top of the fan. And we actually have a student based in London who's looking at those specific things, looking at the fans, trying to find the sites on the fans, because again, it's another tool that we can use. Say, oh, people have chosen the fan. Let's see how many other sites are on the fan. So we're sort of gradually piecing together the types of decisions that people were making about where they were putting their settlements. The earliest settlements are probably on these fans, and then they start being able to survive out on the big floodplain. But then they have to keep changing what happens. Even around Multan, there's all these medieval settlements. They've all appear to be abandoned because perhaps the river moved.
Just a sub-question is that as humans moved from Africa, they came to the coast and then they started moving northwards.
Mm-hmm.
So like Mehergarh is say 12.5, then you go to Mohenjo-daro, which is 7.5, 8. Then you move up to Harappa, which is about 5, 4.5. Then you go up to Soar. So human movement has also determined the location of an archaeological site.
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, I think some of those dates are a bit early. But yeah, but I agree. I mean, I think there is a chronology in the distribution of the sites, absolutely. And I think that's really where, you know, for us at the minute, I was trying to, maybe I wasn't clear enough, but in some respects, we're looking at all of the periods. We're not specifically interested in one period or another period. And I guess I stand, you know, accused of that myself. You know, a lot of my research in the past has been focusing on, say, the Bronze Age or the Iron Age or a particular chronological period. But when you do things like a survey, you find sites of all the periods. And then again, if you work at a very large scale, all of a sudden you can start to see what these patterns are and working out where people were living in different points of time.
Other questions? Yeah.
My question might be an ignorant question for an archaeologist, really, because I'm kind of like now a bit curious about the history of archaeology. And
Yes,
like,
sure.
You know, because, you know, like the way that the Indus Valley civilization was looked at in the colonial era. And
Yes.
now I'm wondering, like, so where did working on the Indus Valley stand in relation to more well-established fields like Egyptology or ancient Greece and Rome?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
was it considered a kind of poor cousin of these places? Or
that's a really good, useful and good question. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's considered a poor cousin, but it does depend on who you ask. What's interesting about the Indus civilization? So it was, and I think this is actually really important. It's not mentioned in the great religious books that we're very familiar with. So it's not in the Bible. It's not in the Quran. And whereas ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, those are things that are referenced in those sorts of religious texts. They're also mentioned in the classical historians make reference to those regions. So the Indus civilization is outside of that Eurocentric tradition. It's also, it doesn't, and there's a big debate about this, the degree to which it's referenced in Indian religious documents and texts. Some would say it is, others would say it's not. So that's a controversial sort of topic, and that's very open, and you can imagine it's quite political in terms of how the interpretations play out. But what's really interesting is that when the Indus civilization was sort of rediscovered in the early 20th century, it was basically being described as this lost civilization. So it was very grand, and it was being, you know, being referenced in the Illustrated London News, and there was a lot of promotion that was happening in the early phases. And there were direct comparisons being made about, you know, the Indus civilization was being used as an example of early urbanism. There's a great paper about the urban revolution by Gordon Child. It makes direct reference to the Indus civilization. So it's woven into the you know, global discussions. But some of the things that make the Indus civilization different is we have texts or inscriptions that we can't read. So at a fundamental level, the type of information that's available is different. So I was having a conversation earlier today about the richness of the Mesopotamian tradition. So we have so much information about, you know, who the gods are, what they mean, how people venerate them, and similar levels of information in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And we don't have access to that same information for the Indus, for example. So some people say, oh, well, that means it's somehow lesser, or it's not as developed. And I think that's just bias and you know, lacking in imagination, shall we say. And I think we're sort of, so we're challenged by the nature of the evidence. But what happens in books that talk about early civilizations, often the Indus civilization is left out because it lacks that textual knowledge. Hopefully the archaeology provides a richness of information that tells us different sorts of things.
But does the military presence in early archaeological studies then have an influence on this? Like, was it a more open field for?
That's an interesting question. So during the early part of the British period, the Archaeological Survey of India was very tightly controlled, and who was allowed to do work and research was restricted, actually. And they were powerful. They employed thousands of people. They had annual expeditions. They would employ people to go off and do surveys. Oral Stein was employed by the Archaeological Survey of India, and he surveyed different regions. He went off and did various things. There's a whole list of people. Military officers were collecting things and documenting them. That was also going into Survey of India records. But after independence and partition, things changed, and there were more, I guess, non-British archaeologists involved, many more Indian archaeologists and Pakistani archaeologists as well, but they were always working as part of the Archaeological Survey of India as well. And in many cases, the Director Generals were born and bred in the subcontinent. They weren't always British. So it wasn't tightly controlled, but there's a long and elaborate history. And there's also, I guess, been a sort of post-colonial evaluation of the Archaeological Survey of India as well. And there's probably books hidden in this, not in this room, but definitely in this building that will, can reveal some of that richness.
I was interested in your initial question there, because it reminded me that many years ago I faced a tripost question asking that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cameron. One of the slides that you showed in the beginning showed the distribution of the Survey of India maps that you have or that exist.
Yep.
I noticed that, so there's a massive gap in the Thar Desert.
Yes.
And then there's a big gap in the center, in central India as well.
That one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that not solely?
And also there's a big gap in Baluchistan. So what we've been piecing together is what is actually available in terms of production. So the Survey of India produced maps at 3 different scales. These are the 1 inch to 1 mile maps, which is the one to, I think it's 66,000, 1 to 66,000. They also produced 1 inch to 1 inch to 2 miles and 1 inch to 4 miles. And they, as far as we can work out, they actually surveyed everything. And then the maps were issued at different scales depending on what they were encountering. So as far as we can tell, there is actually more maps at the 1 inch to 1 mile scale than we have currently, but we haven't yet got access to them all. There are also, I believe, a complete coverage for 1 inch to 2 miles and 1 inch to 4 miles maps that exist. But of course, each one is lower resolution than the other one. So they've got less information on them. The Thar Desert maps, I don't think were ever issued. The other thing we've sort of learned is that some of the maps were only issued in the 19th century. And then interestingly enough, during the Second World War, they made use of the 19th century maps and created a new version of them using, effectively the equivalent of photocopying at the time, and put new grids on them and published them in black and white, low quality military maps for the Second World War. And so some of the maps don't exist in the nice, neat, full color versions that we have. But yeah, I think also the other thing to say is that the distribution that you see there is what we have at the moment based on what we've managed to get copies of from the British Library. But you can see some of the shapes, some of the gaps are very, very square. I think we haven't necessarily selected those or other sorts of things. But I think the other thing to say is that we're looking at printed maps that have made it to Britain. The Survey of India, I understand every map that was produced, copies were sent to the India office. And then copies of that consignment were then peeled off and sent to the University Library in Cambridge and the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And then a copy stayed in the India Office Library. And that's what the British Library collection is now. But I'm confident that, well, we know not every map is in every collection. So all sorts of weird things have happened. You know, someone forgot to post one, it disappeared. Someone took a copy out of one collection and didn't return it. There's probably, I mean, the other thing that nobody that I've ever met has had success is getting access to the Survey of India archives, which are in Dehradun, where they must have a copy of everything in theory. Plus, in theory, they also have all the original documentation that would have been generated by the surveyors. I think they were probably working at much higher scale than we've got. So there's probably many more features that have been surveyed that aren't actually ending up on maps. So convincing the Surveyor General of the Survey of India that this is a worthwhile endeavour, I think will be an important act of diplomatic genius, but we'll see. We'll see.
More question.
You got the.
When you kind of mentioned that there may be these maps that are more high resolution.
Yep.
Presumably some of those you have already looked at in lower resolution.
Yes.
Would you then have the individuals looking at the comparison, or would you use maybe computer?
That's an. Yeah, I think in the end, we'd probably use people. One of the things we've discovered, actually, sometimes people are as fast as a computer, or they're as fast as the person writing the code that needs to tell the computer what to do. So we've had all sorts of, I guess, teething problems where we're trying to actually train a computer to work and save us work, which is taking a lot of time. So in the end, I think when we start to all of those nice yellow maps on here, when they're all georeferenced, we'll tell the computer to go for it, and it'll probably be quite good at it. But yeah, waiting for the computer has been an interesting challenge. But yeah, I think what's interesting, the reason I made reference to the higher resolution, I mean, you know, basically these survey teams were out there, they're using triangulation and chains and mapping, and they're actually documenting things around individual villages. And these, I didn't really explain this, but all of these maps are actually topographic maps. There was a trigonometric survey, which was carried out to map the trigonometry of the subcontinent. Then there was a revenue survey that was carried out. That was all about taxation and much, much higher level information. And that survey was what was used for these topographic maps. We know, as part of what the British Empire used to do, was that they would actually engage in mapping of different scales. So I understand that they tried to map the whole of Ireland at 6 inches to 1 mile. So 6 times the resolution that they were using in the UK, in Britain. Yes. So, and they added all sorts of extra elements to it, including anthropological research and other sorts of things. So this is a very, very serious attempt at engaging in empire in a multiple levels. And there's lots of that history that is not very well known and not very well understood. And we're hoping that we can add a little bit to that in terms of the work that we're doing.
Sounds if you're adding not a little bit, but there's amount.
The danger is there's all these, everyone that's in the team gets like captivated by following up on individual bits, and there's lots of little rabbit holes heading off in lots of different directions. And it's like, we have to say, yeah, okay, come back, do some documentation. And everyone's extremely good at doing both things. So it's good.
Well, thank you again very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.